I never thought I'd be standing in a courtroom at 34 years old, watching the man I loved for 7 years look at me like I was nothing. But that's exactly where I found myself on a cold Tuesday morning in November, wearing the pearl earrings he'd given me on our 5th anniversary. The ones he said made me look like I belonged in his world. My name is Sarah Mitchell. Well, it was Sarah Chen for the last 7 years. I met David at a charity gala in Manhattan. I was there representing the nonprofit I worked for, a veteran support organization that helped former service members transition back into civilian life. He was there because his tech company was one of the sponsors. When he approached me that night, champagne glass in hand, his smile was warm and his eyes were kind. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. He seemed genuinely interested in my work, in my background, in me. I didn't come from money. My father was a Marine, served 3 tours overseas, and my mother was a nurse at the VA hospital. I grew up on military bases, moving every few years, learning to adapt, learning to be strong. After college, I'd worked my way up in the nonprofit sector, pouring my heart into helping people who'd sacrificed everything for this country. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. It was real. David came from a different world. Old money, family, connections, private schools, summer homes. But he never made me feel less than. Or at least, that's what I thought. He pursued me with this quiet intensity, sending flowers to my office, taking me to small, intimate restaurants where we could really talk. 6 months later, he proposed on the Brooklyn Bridge at sunrise. I said yes without hesitation. His family was complicated. His mother, Vivian, was polite but distant. His father had passed away years before, but the Chen family legacy was very much alive through cousins, aunts, uncles, a whole network of people who'd known each other since childhood. I tried so hard to fit in. I learned to use the right fork at dinner parties. I smiled through conversations about people and places I'd never heard of. I stood beside David at countless events, playing the role of the supportive wife. For 7 years, I thought we were building something together. We had a beautiful apartment in Tribeca. We talked about starting a family someday. He said he admired my work, my dedication, my strength. He called me his rock, his anchor in a world that often felt superficial and empty. I believed him. God, I really believed him. The first crack appeared on a Wednesday afternoon in October. I was at my desk at work when my phone buzzed with a notification from our joint bank account. We'd set it up when we got married. Full transparency, full partnership, or so I thought. The notification said a large withdrawal had been made, $75,000. My heart skipped. That wasn't normal. We'd never withdrawn that much at once without discussing it. I immediately called David. He didn't answer. I texted him. Nothing. I tried to tell myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe he was buying something special, planning a surprise. Maybe it was an investment opportunity he'd mentioned and I'd forgotten. But something in my gut twisted with unease. When he came home that evening, he was distracted. I asked him about the withdrawal as casually as I could manage. He barely looked up from his phone. Just some business stuff, Sarah. Don't worry about it. His tone was dismissive, almost irritated that I'd asked. That wasn't like him. Or maybe it was like him, and I'd just been too in love to notice. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I noticed other things. He was on his phone constantly, angling, the screen away from me. He started coming home later, saying he had meetings, deals to close. When I suggested we have dinner together, just the two of us like we used to, he said he was too busy. You don't understand the pressure I'm under right now, Sarah. I need you to be supportive, not needy. Needy. That word stung more than it should have. I'd never been needy. I'd built my own career, maintained my own identity, given him all the space he'd ever asked for. But I swallowed the hurt and told myself he was just stressed. Then I saw the papers. I wasn't snooping. I swear I wasn't. I was looking for our insurance documents because my mother needed to update her medical records and I'd promised to send her a copy. I opened David's study drawer, the one where we kept all our important files. Underneath a folder of tax returns, I found something that made my blood run cold. divorce papers, already drafted, already dated. And beneath them, financial statements I'd never seen before, accounts in his name only, properties I didn't know existed, investments that showed he'd been systematically moving our money, my money, the money I'd contributed from my inheritance when my father passed away, into accounts I couldn't access. My hands shook as I read through the documents. The divorce papers painted a picture of our marriage that I didn't recognize. They described me as unemployed, even though I worked full-time. They listed my contributions to our household as minimal. They requested that I receive only a small settlement, claiming that the bulk of our assets were his premarital property. It was all lies. Careful, calculated lies. The worst part? There was an email thread printed out and clipped to the papers. Messages between David and his lawyer. And there, in black and white, I read his words. She's just an American wife. No family money, no connections, no leverage. This should be straightforward. I need this done quietly before she figures out the family business situation. Just an American wife. As if my citizenship, my background made me disposable, made me worthless. I sat on the floor of his study for what felt like hours, those papers scattered around me. I thought about every moment of our marriage, reframing it through this new, horrible lens. All those times his family had subtly excluded me from conversations. All those business dinners where I smiled and nodded while they spoke in Mandarin, never offering to translate. All those moments when David had told me I was too sensitive, too American, too unable to understand the way things work in our world. I'd thought he was defending me. Turns out he'd been apologizing for me. When David came home that night, I was still sitting there. He walked into the study and froze when he saw me surrounded by his secret plans. For just a second, something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or fear. But it vanished quickly, replaced by cold annoyance. Sarah, you had no right to go through my things. Your things? My voice came out steadier than I felt. These are divorce papers, David. Papers that describe a completely fictional version of our marriage. When were you planning to tell me? Or were you just going to have me served one day and hope I'd go quietly? He had the audacity to sigh, like I was being unreasonable. This doesn't have to be ugly, Sarah. I'm being more than fair. You'll get enough to start over, and we can both move on with our lives. Fair? I stood up, and I felt 7 years of bending, compromising, and shrinking myself start to crack open inside me. You've been hiding money. You've been lying about our assets. You've been planning to blindside me. What part of that is fair? You wouldn't understand, he said, and his voice had this condescending edge that I'd heard before, but always explained away. There are family obligations, business considerations. You're not from this world, Sarah. You never really fit in, and honestly, my mother was right. I should have married someone who understood our culture, our expectations. There it was. The truth he'd been hiding behind every kind word, every affectionate gesture, every promise. I wasn't his partner. I was his American experiment. And now that the novelty had worn off, I was just an inconvenience to be handled. I didn't cry, not then. I looked at him, this man I'd loved, this stranger I'd been sleeping beside, and I said, I want my own lawyer, and I'm not signing anything until every single asset is accounted for. His face hardened. Don't make this difficult, Sarah. You have no idea what you're up against. But here's the thing about growing up as a military kid, about spending your childhood learning to adapt and survive and stand back up every time life knocks you down. You learn how to fight. Maybe not with money or connections, but with pure, stubborn resilience. I moved out the next day. I found a small apartment in Queens, nothing like the luxury I'd gotten used to, but it was mine. I hired a lawyer, a woman named Margaret Chen, ironically enough, who specialized in complex divorces and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when her clients were being taken advantage of. She was expensive, but she agreed to work with me on the fees when I explained my situation. Margaret was everything I needed in that moment. Sharp, no nonsense, and completely unintimidated by David's family money. She immediately filed motions to freeze our joint assets and started the process of discovery, forcing David to disclose everything. The next 3 months were a blur of depositions, document requests, and increasingly hostile exchanges through our lawyers. David's legal team tried every tactic in the book. They claimed I'd been unfaithful. I hadn't. They suggested I had substance abuse problems. I didn't. They tried to paint me as a gold digger who'd married David for his money, conveniently ignoring that I'd had my own career and had actually contributed a significant inheritance to our shared accounts. But Margaret was thorough. She found everything: the offshore accounts, the properties he'd purchased in his name only using our joint funds, the trust fund he'd hidden from me, even the prenuptial agreement his lawyer had drafted but never had me sign because, as his emails revealed, he'd been worried I'd asked too many questions. I learned something during those months. I learned that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for. Every time David's lawyers tried to intimidate me, every time his family called to tell me I was being vindictive, every time I saw our friends, well, his friends, post pictures of parties I was no longer invited to, I held my head higher. My mother flew out to stay with me for a few weeks. She'd never particularly liked David. Mothers have instincts about these things. But she never said, "I told you so." Instead, she held me while I cried, reminded me of who I was before David, and told me stories about my father, about how he'd always said that honor and integrity mattered more than money or status, that you could tell everything about a person by how they treated people who couldn't do anything for them. David had failed that test spectacularly. The court date was set for November 15th. As it approached, I felt this strange mixture of dread and relief. Part of me wanted it to be over, wanted to close this chapter and never look back. But another part of me wanted my day in court, wanted someone in authority to look at what David had done and call it what it was: fraud, manipulation, betrayal. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. I wore a navy suit, professional, serious, strong. I put on those pearl earrings, not because they were from him, but because they were mine now. Every gift he'd ever given me, I'd earned by the years I'd spent supporting him, believing in him, loving him. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Fluorescent lights, worn wooden, benches, the smell of old paper and institutional coffee. David was already there with his lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who'd perfected the art of looking bored and superior at the same time. David didn't look at me when I walked in. He just scrolled through his phone, perfectly composed, perfectly confident. Margaret squeezed my hand as we sat down. "Remember," she whispered, "truth is our weapon today. Just stay calm and tell the truth." The judge entered and we all stood. Honorable Judge Patricia Morrison. I'd looked her up beforehand, 58 years old, former prosecutor, known for being fair but tough on anyone who tried to play games in her courtroom. She settled into her seat and looked over her glasses at both parties. The proceedings began with David's lawyer making his case. He was smooth, I'll give him that. He painted a picture of a marriage that had simply run its course, of a generous settlement offer that I was unreasonably refusing. He made it sound so civilized, so mutual, so simple. Then, Margaret stood up, and she methodically, carefully, presented every piece of evidence we'd gathered: the hidden accounts, the transferred funds, the properties purchased with joint money and titled in David's name alone, the emails where David discussed how to minimize my settlement, the financial records showing that I'd contributed over $200,000 to our marriage, my inheritance, my savings, my earnings. I watched David's face as Margaret spoke. For the first time, I saw his composure crack. His jaw tightened. His lawyer kept objecting, but Judge Morrison overruled him every time, saying she wanted to hear all the facts before making any rulings. Then came the moment that changed everything. Margaret presented one final piece of evidence: records showing that David had been in the process of transferring property overseas, to accounts in Hong Kong, clearly trying to hide assets before the divorce was finalized. It was a smoking gun, proof of exactly the kind of fraud that judges take very seriously. David's lawyer jumped up, claiming the documents were irrelevant, that there were legitimate business reasons. But Judge Morrison held up her hand for silence. She looked directly at David. "Mr. Chen, I've presided over a lot of divorces in my career. I've seen people at their worst, fighting over everything from houses to family pets. But what I don't tolerate in my courtroom is fraud. Hiding assets, transferring funds, attempting to deprive a spouse of their rightful share. These are serious matters." David finally spoke, and his voice had that condescending edge I'd come to recognize. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a complex situation. My wife," he practically sneered the word, "she's just an American wife who doesn't understand the intricacies of international business. She's making this out to be something it's not." Just an American wife. There it was again. That phrase he'd written in emails, that concept that had apparently defined how he saw me throughout our entire marriage. In that moment, in front of the judge, and the lawyers and the court reporter, he'd finally said it out loud. He'd revealed exactly what he thought of me. The courtroom went quiet. Judge Morrison slowly removed her glasses and set them on her desk. She looked at David for a long moment, and something in her expression made my heart skip. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice cutting through, the silence like a blade. "I'm going to tell you something I don't often share in my courtroom. I'm a military brat. My father served in Vietnam. My mother held our family together through 3 deployments and more hardship than you can probably imagine. I know exactly what it means to be just an American. Wife, mother, daughter." She stood up. Then, slowly, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. David's face had gone pale. "These just American military families serve this country in ways that people like you will never understand or appreciate. They sacrifice, they adapt, they survive. And let me be crystal clear. There is nothing just about any of them." Judge Morrison looked directly at me then, and her expression softened. "Ma'am," she said, and her voice carried a weight of respect that made tears spring to my eyes. "Thank you. Thank you for your family's service. Thank you for your work supporting our veterans. And I'm sorry that you weren't given the respect and honesty you deserved in your marriage." I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. This judge, this woman who didn't know me, who had no reason to care about my story beyond the legal facts, had seen me, had valued me, had acknowledged everything that David had tried so hard to diminish. Judge Morrison sat back down and turned her attention to the papers in front of her. When she spoke again, her tone was all business, but there was steel underneath. "I'm ruling in favor of Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Mitchell, on every contested point. The hidden accounts will be frozen and divided equitably. The properties purchased with joint funds will be sold and proceeds split. Mr. Chen will be responsible for all legal fees, including Mrs. Mitchell's attorney costs. Furthermore, I'm referring the matter of the overseas transfers to the appropriate authorities for investigation into possible fraud." David's lawyer tried to object, tried to request a recess, but Judge Morrison wasn't having it. "This hearing is concluded. Mr. Chen, you came into my courtroom thinking your money and your attitude would carry the day. But in here, character matters, honesty matters, and you've shown a stunning lack of both." As we left the courtroom, I felt like I was floating. Margaret was grinning, already talking about next steps and timeline and settlements, but I was still processing what had just happened. In one moment, one statement, Judge Morrison had validated everything I'd been feeling, everything I'd been questioning. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't too sensitive. I wasn't just anything. I was enough. I had always been enough. David tried to approach me in the hallway, but Margaret stepped between us. Whatever he wanted to say, whatever excuse or justification he'd prepared, I didn't need to hear it. I'd heard enough. I'd seen enough. I was done. The final settlement came through 6 weeks later. I got my inheritance back, plus half of everything we'd built during the marriage, plus damages for the hidden assets. It was more money than I'd ever had in my life. But more importantly, I got my dignity back. My sense of self. My understanding that I hadn't been the problem, he had been. I moved to a different apartment, This one in Brooklyn with a view of the bridge where he'd proposed. Some people might think that's masochistic, but for me, it felt like reclaiming something. That bridge was part of my city, my story, before it was part of our story. It belonged to me, not to the memory of him. I threw myself back into my work at the nonprofit. My colleagues, the veterans I worked with, they'd been my real family all along. They'd never judged me for my background or my bank account. They'd never needed me to be anything other than someone who cared and showed up. One of the veterans I'd been working with, a woman named Lisa who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, said something to me about a month after the divorce was finalized. We were having coffee after a job placement meeting, and she suddenly looked at me and said, "You seem different, lighter somehow." I thought about that for a moment. I think I spent 7 years trying to be someone I wasn't, I told her. Someone quieter, smaller, more palatable. I forgot who I was before. Lisa nodded. She understood about losing yourself and finding your way back. And now? Now I'm remembering. It's been 8 months since that day in the courtroom. 8 months since Judge Morrison stood up and reminded me what I was worth. I still wear the pearl earrings sometimes, but now they remind me of my own strength, not of a gift from someone who never really valued me. I heard through mutual acquaintances that David got engaged again to a woman from a prominent Hong Kong family. Someone who understands his world, I suppose. I felt nothing when I heard that news. No jealousy, no anger, not even satisfaction. Just nothing. He was someone I used to know, someone I used to love. But he was no longer a part of my story except as a chapter I'd closed. My mother asked me once if I regretted the 7 years I'd spent with David. I thought about it, really thought about it. No, I finally said. Those years taught me what I don't want, who I don't want to be. They taught me that I can survive losing everything I thought I needed. They taught me that I'm stronger than I knew. Your father would be proud, she said quietly. You served your time in a different kind of battle, and you came home with your honor intact. I like that way of thinking about it. A battle. A deployment. A mission that I completed with dignity, even when the person beside me wasn't fighting for the same things I was. Last week, I ran into Judge Morrison at a fundraiser for Veterans Services. She probably didn't remember me. She sees hundreds of cases. But I went up to her anyway. Your Honor, I said, I don't know if you remember me, but she smiled, cutting me off gently. The American wife, she said. Of course I remember. How are you doing? We talked for a few minutes. I told her about my work, about how the settlement had allowed me to start a new program at the nonprofit. She told me about her own father, about the sacrifices her family had made, about why she'd been so offended by David's dismissive words that day. People like your ex-husband, she said. They think respect is something that comes from money or status. They don't understand that real respect is earned through character, through how you treat people, through what you do when no one's watching. You have that kind of respect. Don't ever let anyone make you forget it again. As I walked home that evening, through the streets of the city I loved, I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the courtroom showdown, the painful process of rebuilding. And I realized something. I wasn't the same person who'd said yes on that bridge 7 years ago. That Sarah had been hopeful and trusting and maybe a little naive. This Sarah, the one I'd become, she was hopeful too, but in a different way. Hopeful because she knew she could survive hard things. Trusting but with better judgment about who deserved that trust. Not naive but not cynical either. Just awake, present, real. I'm not going to lie and say everything is perfect. Now, some days are hard. Some days I still feel the ghost of what I thought my life would be. But most days I feel free. Free to be exactly who I am, without apology, without explanation. Just an American wife who became an American woman who knows her worth. And you know what? That's more than enough. That's everything.